Hello everyone. In this episode of Geo Interview, we have the honor of hosting Dr. Krishna B. Kumar, the Vice President of RAND Corporation and a Professor of Economic Development at Pardee RAND Graduate School. Dr. Kumar holds a PhD in Economics from the University of Chicago and has led various projects of economic development and education policy for countries such as North Korea, USA, China, and India. His core areas of research vary from international economic relations and economic growth to education policy and analysis methodology. So in today's session, we will be discoursing on the subject of unlocking prosperity in Global South. I, Abhinav Goyal, on behalf of the Geostrata, warmly welcome you, Professor, and it's a privilege to have you among us.
Thank you so much for having me, Abhinav. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, sir. So to start with a very broad issue, what is your outlook on the Global South? And what trajectory do you see emerging markets assuming over the next 10 years, given the realities of today and trends of the past?
Yes, that is a good way to start. Indeed, I know it's a cliche, but it's worth saying that it's an unprecedented time for the global economy, which has suffered a series of back-to-back shocks. I still think we are facing the long tail of the global financial crisis of 2008 because there's been a move away from economic openness and trade. We have seen a rise in nationalistic populism across countries, not just the US, but really, across democracies and autocracies in the world. And there's been a rise in inequality within countries and across countries. And then even as we were trying to recover from all this, we got hit with a once in a lifetime pandemic in the form of COVID-19. And that's brought about a reversal of gains in global poverty, which we had accrued over the past, 2 or 3 decades. Further increase in the inequality that I mentioned. There was a flood of monetary and fiscal stimuli across the board, developed countries, developing countries, and they're all exerting their toll in the form of global inflation right now. And as if all this was not enough, Russia invaded Ukraine, which caused a global food and energy crisis. A few African countries are pretty much in famine or in the brink of famines. And of course, because of the war, there's been geopolitical realignments and reverberations, which have also affected not just the geopolitical situation, but also the global economic situation. If you take a couple of the giants in the global south, China has faced a slowdown from COVID-19 lockdowns. The economy is unlikely to grow by much more than 3% this year, which is, a big fall for China from its 9% and 10% growth. It is at the heart of all the supply chain snarls that are bedeviling the global economy. And, of course, it's also at the heart of much of the geopolitical headwinds that it itself faces and is causing on others. China also has suffered a demographic setback. For the first time, their census showed that peak working age population might be declining, and it has a growing, corporate and household debt. India has been a little bit of a bright picture, despite its high inflation that it's trying to combat. The IMF, for example, has predicted India will grow 6.8% this fiscal year, even though it's down from 8.7%. Looking at how badly others are doing, this doesn't seem too bad. But, India has some serious long-run issues. It has thus far failed to cash in on its so-called demographic dividend, in the sense that it has a very young population, but this population needs to become productive, given education and training and jobs. And, India has really not fully delivered on that. And of course, it is lagging in low-end manufacturing and agricultural transformation. This is the process by which people move from agriculture to manufacturing and productivity grows. So, but the situation is not, even as good for other emerging economies, which many claim might be on the verge of a lost decade. So this is brought about by trade tension, not just going back to the global recession, but the ensuing US-China trade wars. Other countries are caught in between. Of course, COVID-19, supply chains, the global inflation that I mentioned, and the war. So it's almost like a perfect storm for emerging economies. So it's not surprising that the IMF global forecast for growth is 3.2% this year and 2.7% in 2023. Just think about that for a moment. Economic growth of emerging markets is not very different from US third quarter 2022 growth, which is 2.6%. The only way poorer developing countries can catch up is by growing faster, and it's a process economists call convergence. And that was already slowing down before COVID and so on, and it's been exacerbated by the last couple of shocks. So emerging economies which benefited from the golden period of globalization, which pretty much started, the recent one at least, started in 1990. As I said, the tail of the Great Recession was already felt, but I feel like by 2015 they had run the course, and it's not clear that the future miracles will really benefit. Anyway, in summary, when you look at all this, the next couple of years look pretty treacherous for the global South, but I'm still cautiously optimistic that with appropriate policies for the long run, these countries can get on a more stable and also resilient footing, resilient to all these shocks.
Well, Professor, that was very insightful. And the situation is such that no country would ask such a situation to have, because it is not really an ideal condition to grow. And to pick up a point that you told about the population, so how do you approach the big population of global South? Do you think it would play a big role in, improving the economy, or it can act as an hindrance? Because if we see, India has a very large population, India and China, but we say that it is not very productive, right? So how do you approach the large population of global South? Is it something to approach positively, or is it something the way China looks at it, or the China looked at it in the past?
Well, let's start there, right? Like China looked at it in the past as a problem and tried to curb population through its one-child policy. I have to say that it's come back to bite China in the form of a decreasing population. People do not want to have kids now, even though the government has come out and said 2 or even 3 children are okay. There's a natural phenomenon called demographic transition that happens when countries become richer as it gets costlier and costlier time-wise. The opportunity cost of having children goes up. Automatically, the population, comes down. You can see even countries like India having much lower fertility rate than they have now than they had in the last, 2 or 3 decades. So that would have automatically happened. So in my opinion, looking as an economist with positive some game point of view in life rather than a zero-sum game point of view, I always think that a country can benefit from its people. And in particular, people talk about aging. China, the cliche goes, is going to become older before it becomes richer. And of course, countries like Italy, Japan, the East Asian countries, in South Korea, for example, the total fertility rate is 0.8. Forget about replacing, a couple. They cannot even replace individually, the population. So compared to all this, countries in the Middle East, Bangladesh, India, South Asia, Africa, where the median age of the population is in the 20s, I think it is a bonanza. The world as a whole is not getting older. It's the rich countries that are getting older, and the more emerging economies have very young populations. Now, you asked whether it is a positive or a negative. Well, it depends on policies. What policies government play? You would be familiar with the 2011 Arab Spring in the Middle East, which was in fact caused because youth did not perceive as having economic opportunities. Of course, they were also, complaining about the politics of the region, but primarily it was lack of economic opportunities. So it will be a problem if the government doesn't figure out how to educate this large number of young people and create situations so that the private sector can create jobs. Governments don't create jobs. You can create government jobs, but that's not always good. You should have the bare minimum that you need to govern the country. But it's really the private sector that create jobs. But what governments can do is provide the right kind of incentives and policy environment for the private sector to create jobs. If you don't do that, well, then this young population then becomes a problem. They're going to take to the streets and they're going to protest. And can you blame them? And in some countries, and India has the danger of falling into this, that we've now taken more and more care of the supply. The quality of education is highly uneven. We give degrees like there's no tomorrow. It's not clear how much worth they have, so on and so forth. On the other hand, the demand side, like who's going to employ these people, is still not fully taken care of. And that imbalance can also create problems. So that's why it's called demographic dividend. But before you can cash the dividend check, there's a lot of very hard work to be done on creating market relevant skills on the supply side of labor, but also creating the demand for labor. That's the way I would look at population. At this point also, we are stuck with the population we have. What are we going to do? The best thing to do is to see how to empower people. If you empower people, the country gets empowered in a democracy such as India.
Well, I think, Professor, the fact that India has such a young population, it's really a bonanza for India. It really employs it productively. And I think everyone would agree with it. So moving ahead, how is economic prosperity linked with public policy choices? And is there anything more to it, such as inherent entrepreneurial mindsets, or is it just chance and circumstance?
That's a terrific question. Of course, I've devoted my life to studying economic policy, so I have vested interest to say that policies matter. But really think about it. All people are inherently entrepreneurial. We are curious people. We want to tinker. We want to invent. We want to start the next business. We want to write the next player, movie or novel, right? Like, so we are by nature, very curious, creative people. The only factor that doesn't run into diminishing returns that economists call that, if you add more and more, the additional is commensurately less. The only factor that does not have diminishing returns is human ingenuity, right? So, so that's why I feel that all people are inherently entrepreneurial. So, we RAND did this study recently where, I led a study to do some blue sky thinking on North Korea. What would be the case if North Korea developed, if it were a more peaceful country, right? And what we found was in a country that is so constrained for private sector, there was a, informal private sector flourishing. These are called the jangmadang. They are, informal shops. And, we couldn't help but think that if only the government formalized them, provided them the right environment to thrive, how much they could grow instead of being buried underground and small enough so that they escape detection. And by the way, the government can collect taxes to boot from the formal sector. So again, I don't think that some people are, entrepreneurial and others are not. Let us look at, the so-called culture argument that people say. Until 1991, people will say, India had a Hindu rate of growth, which is like 2-3%, not more than the developed countries. And as I said, you have to grow at 8 to 9% to catch up with them. What happened in 1991? A crisis forced India to change its policies. It became more open, less bureaucratic, and automatically the country started growing. It's not that en masse, Indians stopped being Hindu and became Protestant. Of course, India has lots of other religion, but you get what I'm saying, right? So this Hindu rate of growth was a little bit of a misnomer. So I don't think culture that much matters. So I think it really does, come to policy. Of course, you have to, be context specific. I'm not saying culture doesn't matter in the sense that, the same policies without adaptation will work anywhere. But I would not say that it's either the culture or lack of entrepreneurship that holds people down. It's policies. So, take this difficult juncture that we, talked about. Even at this point, policies that focus on what is called total factor productivity growth, which is the engine of growth, if you will. It's the combination of factors that increase the productivity of everything like labor and capital and so on, and human capital accumulation, education, training, and so on, can help countries both get out of the current predicament and be, for example, more resilient in the future. Take India, for example. I would say that Indian growth has left a lot of the unskilled and agricultural workers behind. If you look at China, a lot of the non-coastal people have been left behind. And this is the case. You can, come up with many countries that have this the issue that you need, more inclusive growth to empower all these people and for the countries to grow. And to be fair, countries are following policies. So China's policies are interesting because it's caught in this geopolitical maelstrom. It is turned more and more inward. In fact, it is gone from soft tech to hard tech, in focusing on second and third tier cities to actually make more and more hardware. Because it's not allowed to import, for example, chips from other places and so on. But the question to ask in that case is, can innovation be mandated, and can the state always be hovering in the background of the private sector, hampering innovation? In the case of India, the government is playing a role by creating this tech stack, if you will, for payments, for allowing smaller business-to-business communication and so on, and it has increased formalization in the financial sector, and all this is done with the aim of avoiding what is called the middle income trap. That India is very worried. It grew very fast, and now is it stagnating? Is a worry that it has with other countries. But again, there are some problems with this as well. Will it lead to further monopolization? Will only big companies take advantage of it? Where will the talent come from? Going back to your population question, we have people, but do they have the right talent? And if you look at other emerging countries' policies, Sri Lanka is a big warning. They have to decrease debt burden. Stability is the key. So to summarize, I think policies do matter, and the kind of policies that I think can serve the global South right now is to focus on this total factor productivity, human capital, the future of work. Well, AI and automation are not going to come and take away all the jobs, but workers still do need the right skills to work with technology. And COVID-19 might have hastened the move with virtual working and so on. So both, China and India, and indeed all of global South, have to focus on lifelong learning. And going back to these policies, you need policy packages. For example, I mentioned that the supply of skill in India has been steadily improving, but the demand for those skills have not moved. So, you have to think in terms of policy packages. If you just create the supply and don't create the demand, the labor is going to leave, and you're going to end up with brain drain.
Well, Professor, that was very insightful. And talking about the entrepreneurial mindsets, you said that everyone has that kind of mindset. And I guess it's about the synergy of government policies, because it also provides incentives to the youngsters. Exactly. Because they might have ideas, but they don't have the right condition. But if the government provides proper policies, then it can work in synergy. So that was very insightful, Professor.
Absolutely. How easy, for example, is it to start a business? How easy is it to grow? Those are the kinds of synergies that you're talking about. Completely agree with you.
So moving on, Professor, ahead, what could be the best trade policy for a hypothetical global South country to financially engage with the rest of the world?
Let me start by saying I'm not trying to go from one gloomy response to another. It is one of the hardest times for a developing country, a country in global South, to devise a trade policy, because I really do think that the world is becoming more and more closed. I mentioned all the long tail of the 2008 Great Recession, but more recently, the US-China trade wars have caught other countries in the midst. These are two of the largest traders in the world, and those that are part of the supply chain get caught in this trade war as well. The World Trade Organization, which used to broker across countries, arbitrate trade disputes, has lost a lot of power. you have a proliferation of what is called regional trade agreements or RTAs. And the unfortunate problem with that is that this doesn't always exploit comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is a principle that the British economist David Ricardo came up with a couple of 100 years back to argue that it's not absolute advantage, productivity advantage that matters. Relatively, what are you good at compared to the other country? And that's what you will produce. And, if you do regional trade agreements, you're not exploiting the global comparative advantages that exist out there. Meanwhile, autocracies are gaining clout, and it's not just China, but there are even smaller ones. They're forming their own regional trade agreements. Even as Western democracies are concerned more and more about human rights, national security, and so on. UNCTAD, the UN organization, graphed the stockpile of import restrictions in the form of the percentage of imports that are covered by restrictions since 2009, and that has been steadily increasing. And there's a good reason for all of this, is that when it comes to trade, free trade, there's no hero, there are only villains, because everybody wants to export and nobody wants to import. So until Elon Musk figures how we can all live in Mars, the global trade balance has to be zero. So if somebody has to export, somebody has to import. And that is the whole beauty of comparative advantage. So imports are, there is well-documented research showing how imports helped India after the 1991 liberalization to grow. So imports are not bad, but for political reason, everybody thinks they should only export and nobody, should import. And that's not going to work out. It's just mathematical impossibility, right? So for this, hypothetical global South country, if you will, I don't think, national policies alone will suffice, right? Because when it comes to trade, it takes two to tango, right? So individual nations can show some restraint in import restrictions and trade barriers, but trade is an area where broader cooperation is required. And I honestly think G7 countries, the more developed countries, have to take the lead and become, more open. Often, you have, national security concern or technical requirements. These are the rationale given for trade restrictions. So, the world as a whole, the developed world as a whole, has become closed. And I mentioned earlier that, that period of 1990 to 2050 was a golden age of globalization. And that coincided with emerging economy growth and poverty reduction. Hundreds of millions of people in the world, in China, in India, and other developing countries, have been lifted out of poverty because of trade. Yes, it is cost inequality within countries like the US, and that needs to be addressed. And I've written a lot about it, that we need inclusive globalization just as we need inclusive growth. But throwing the baby out with the bathwater is not the right answer, because there are the next cohort of countries that want to become the China and the India and the East Asian miracles and grow countries like Ethiopia, which are now affected by this, the problem with global trade. There's also another issue that is increasingly becoming important with trade that this hypothetical country needs to be aware of, which is that geopolitics is becoming more and more fraught, and it's increasing with global economics in a very complex way. It's in fact hard to disentangle the two, especially in decisions of trade and technology. Right, so geoeconomic tools, for example, have been increasingly used to sanction Russia in this war that it is waging against Ukraine, and the so-called middle powers are caught in between great power competition. And so it's like it's a self-perpetuating cycle. This reinforces the trend towards regional trade agreements, and as always, the impact is on the world's most vulnerable, as you can see with the recent food and energy security. A lot of it is because the grain in Ukraine cannot get out to feed the starving millions in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and so on. So The Economist recently wrote, which I think is worth quoting. It said that the world would become more fractured and mutually suspicious, not to mention poorer than it could have been with globalization. So putting all these elements together, I think the best trade policy for this hypothetical global South country would have elements of engaging with other countries in the global South, both to trade among themselves, but also to persuade the developed countries to stay open. Middle powers, I think, do have agency if they band together. And of course, you have to engage with developed countries as well, persuading them to become more open. And of course, you have to set an example yourself. You cannot be requesting other countries to stay open and, impose export or import restrictions. You should allow freer trade. And you have to diversify trade partners across different levels of development, because I feel that small clubs, which is what we've ended up having since the collapse or the decrease in power of the WTO, is that they don't exploit the global competitive advantages.
Well, Professor, given the interdependencies, so it's really not possible to just think about the domestic policy if we want to speculate about a country. It's not just about the global south. So
Exactly.
in the current global scenario, we also have to think about the other countries too, to speculate
Exactly.
about the nourishment of one single
Yeah.
country, be it global south or global north. Well,
Yeah,
Professor, that was
absolutely. Absolutely. And I really hope that the WTO comes back in its former form, because I think it should be global trade, not regional trade. Exactly right.
well, Professor, that was very enlightening. So, going on ahead with the interview, how do you think cash-starved governments provide for productive infrastructure, and what are the opportunities and challenges involved in international borrowing, if we see the case of China, and how are global South countries viewing it presently?
Another great question. I've read estimates such as 15 trillion US dollars as the projected shortfall, for financing infrastructure in developing countries. Infrastructure, of course, is very crucial. You and I, travel on roads with potholes and, experience power cuts, et cetera, et cetera. Many economists would consider this infrastructure to be part of this total factor productivity, or TFP, that I talked about. And, increasingly, you have this alphabet soup of governmental organizations people talk about for getting assistance and loans for infrastructure. BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative of China, is now well known. And then China has also now started the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIB. And to some extent, in response to the Chinese efforts, the US-led Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, is also intended to help countries develop infrastructure. However, some global South economies, governments may perceive drawbacks such as dependence on other countries and debt reliance in these avenues for funds. Of course, if you don't want to go there, there are multilateral development institutions such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, African Development Bank, et cetera, which of course have infrastructure as one of their pillars as well. But I think we shouldn't forget that there are lots of private opportunities, right? There's equity funding, bond financing. Countries can issue bonds in the global capital market to raise funds. There are international banks countries could borrow from. There are sovereign wealth funds. Of course, sovereign wealth funds are government run, but it's government funds, but they usually run with a little bit more of an international market perspective. So that's why I club them with other private sources. Some countries are now middle income enough. There is a rich class, middle class, which has saving potential. So there are domestic sources of financing as well. Not all of it has to be international. And it's hard to discuss infrastructure and private financing without also talking about public-private partnerships. They're sometimes called PPPs or P3s. They're particularly discussed in the context of infrastructure. The financing can be private, but also the building. And then after operating for some years, the infrastructure can be transferred to governments. The thing that is important is, just as with all the other investment, why would an investor invest in a particular country? They should perceive some rate of return, right? Otherwise, investors out of charity are not going to keep pumping billions and billions of dollars. That is not a sustainable way to finance infrastructure. So it's important to have fiscal discipline. Otherwise, the cost of borrowing is going to go up. Whether it's from local sources or foreign sources, it's a global capital market. So if some country is defaulting or it's not having sound macroeconomic, fundamentals and an environment that provides confidence to investors, the cost of borrowing is going to go up. You also need to avoid risk of expropriation, which is a problem in some countries, that private investors put in a lot of money and then the government confiscates everything and says bye to private investors. Then who else is going to come in the next round to invest? So all these things, decreasing project execution time, not putting too many constraints on those who are willing to, build roads and so on. Of course, you have to, take care of national interests. Nothing that I said should be taken in extremes, but I'm just outlining all the factors. All of this will decrease the risk premium, right, involved in both the international and domestic financing of infrastructure projects. One last thing I would say as well is that these days it's hard to discuss infrastructure financing without discussing sustainability. Power plants, which are a crucial part of infrastructure for countries such as India, but most countries in global south, will be operational for decades. Decisions that policymakers are making right now will matter for long-run climate change. In fact, we are facing some of the issues with past, decisions made decades, if not, centuries back. So there's some recent work which is not very optimistic on this front, which says that both domestic and international investors have not tended to go green when it comes to being forward thinking. So that kind of forward thinking infrastructure investment, why not build green right away instead of making all the mistakes other countries have made in the past, is something that policymakers have to think about.
Well, Professor, I think that really sums up the issue very well. And as you said, countries really need to look at the alternative financing, as you mentioned about bonds. So yeah, that was very insightful. So moving on to the next part, what is your present risk analysis of the global economy, like given the current chaotic situation, and what is in store for the people of Global South? The UNTAD has warned in its 2022 Trade and Development Report, and I quote, monetary and fiscal policy moves in advanced economies risk pushing the world towards global recession and prolonged stagnation, inflicting worse damage than the financial crisis in 2008, as you mentioned earlier, and the COVID-19 shock in 2020.
Now it's your turn to be even gloomier than me, but since you mentioned monetary policy, let's start with inflation. I think that is a fundamental global problem that the world is facing. I feel that much of the policy options that countries have developed and developing in the global south, the policy options may not result in this so-called, soft landing. Why? Because there's simply no way to tame inflation other than monetary tightening. Many people have, likened it to, letting the tiger out of the cage. That is easy, but getting the tiger back into the cage is a very difficult and painful process. And even those who are skeptical that a central bank can really control the real economy, are warning of a contraction, of a global recession. And if you really think about it, those at the bottom of the pyramid benefited the least by the expansion of easy money, liquidity, and so on, because these primarily go to the formal sector. When the interest rate is low, it's not as if the poorest of people are running out to buy cars and refrigerators and so on. But they're also hurt the most by tightening, because when there's a recession, it's the poorest who are first laid off, if you will, because they are typically less skilled and so on. So, first of all, there need to be longer term reforms that take their plight into account before we get into this kind of an inflationary situation. And the question to ask here is, are we overreacting? Right? Like whenever every crisis comes about, if we, inject a lot of monetary, stimulus, does that cause inflation, or even, fiscal stimulus, right? It has to be much more targeted. If there's a large stimulus in conjunction with an accommodative monetary policy, you're going to have inflation. I have to say that you cannot just blame the advanced countries. As policies need to get back to restraint. Many of these countries have overspent and they need to tighten their belts. Austerity repeatedly gets a bad name, for example, during the Greek crisis, but that is what got you in the crisis in the first place. it's overspending and not spending in the right productivity enhancing activities that got countries in this situation. So now we cannot go and say spend more and loosen your belt so that people don't hurt. I mean, think about it. 20% of Indian budget as well as the US budget is spent on interest payments. That is a huge opportunity cost for developing health and education and so on. So how can we just take on more and more debt, as a whole in the world? And at some point you have to tax taxpayers to pay for this debt, and they're going to rebel. Too many low-income countries are already in debt distress. So again, we have to be a little bit careful about asking for less austerity or like freer spending, whether it is by the developed or developing countries. In my opinion, I think that's what got us here in the first place. So whether the global economy looking forward, as I said, back-to-back global shocks have put the world on its back foot. I do think that there are a rough few years ahead if you want to think of risk analysis. It's also hard to see how the global geopolitical, geoeconomic order is going to look like after this war, the realignments, if it is restored at all. We shouldn't be surprised if a few more countries default. Sri Lanka might not be an isolated incident. But at the same time, the world is not without its bright spots. A few countries, emerging economies are growing, showing strength and resilience. As I mentioned, compared to other countries, India doesn't seem to be in a bad situation. I think there are many other countries that would love the IMF forecast of 6.8% growth. With China, we just have to wait and see whether the demographic challenge, whether the debt crises are going to derail its meteoric raise. We're all heavily intertwined in the world, and when a large economy catches cold, the rest of the world is going to sneeze. But let me leave this particular risk analysis with a positive, cautiously optimistic note that an unerring focus on people and human capital will do the world a lot of good. And you mentioned that developing countries have huge populations. Let's view populations as a resource, but we need to empower that resource, right? So sound policies regarding human capital and productivity can both increase resilience and growth, and these are now more important than ever.
Well, Professor, I think that would really give our viewers and us a clear understanding of the economic relations in the global south. And I would like to thank you, Professor, for taking out time for us from a busy schedule. And before leaving, I would like to ask you a question. So you have been in the field of international economic relations since a long time. So how has been your experience? Would you like to share it with us?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. What you're all doing is really amazing. In fact, I have to say, it's just looking at all of you that I feel so optimistic about the future. And in every country, it's really the young who have to shape the future because it is your future. The fact that there is so much talent always, that's what always gives me hope. And that's why among all the things that I do, I love teaching because I get to interact with people like all of you. It gives me a lot of hope that you will come up with creative solutions. You can never write humanity or human ingenuity off. As I said, it's the only resource that we know that doesn't suffer from diminishing returns. As far as my own career trajectory, it has been sort of long, and it is adapted to circumstances, if you will. I started off as a growth economist, but over time, and especially working for this amazing organization that I work with, RAND, where we focus on complex system dynamics. We don't look at things purely as economic, purely as geopolitical, purely as international relations. All these things come together. That's why I was saying, like, even when it comes to trade, it's just close to, in trade and technology, you cannot separate out the economics from the geopolitics and international relations. And for me, that has been, the sort of the joy in this ride, if you will. The fact that by very nature, I'm into looking at interconnections across what might seem, separate areas. You cannot make trade policy without thinking about the geopolitics, without thinking about the economics, without thinking about inequality. And the organization that I'm in, the work that I do, bring all these things together and allows me to take a crack at the big picture. So that's what has been my experience and my pleasure being in this field. And I wish all of you all the best as you pursue your aspirations in these or related fields.
Well, Professor, thank you very much for your wishes. And I think your experience, the glimpse of your experience would really serve as an inspiration for our viewers too. So thank you very much, Professor.